Hello and welcome to the GlobalChurch Project. I'm Graham Hill. Joe Saxton is the director of 3DM, a movement with a passion to change the world by putting discipleship and mission back into the hands of ordinary people. Her responsibilities include leadership of 3DM Stand, a new initiative equipping women for leadership and influence wherever God has placed them. Originally from the United Kingdom, Joe Saxton planted missional congregations there amongst college students and young adults. Since moving to the United States, she served on church planting teams in missional communities, ranging in areas from the suburbs to the inner city. Jo Saxton continues to church plant. She's the author of 3 books, and she's a widely sought after conference speaker. Jo Saxton, welcome to the Global Church Project.
Thank you.
Can you tell us something about how you came to faith and ended up getting involved in Christian ministry?
Okay, so my background, spiritual-wise, is kind of diverse. My grandfather was a Muslim leader. My background is Nigerian, and then I grew up in London. And a range of my relatives have a number of beliefs, a whole plethora of belief systems. And I became a Christian when I was 9 through the ministry of a local church in London. And they were very committed to taking kids seriously in the journey of faith. And I remember my friends inviting me to a kids club. I think it was table tennis and fighting or something like that. And them talking about Jesus and how great he was. And I'd heard of Jesus before. It wasn't that he was new to me, but the way they described him in a personal sense was both intimidating and inspiring at the same time. I do remember that. And so within maybe a matter of 6-7 weeks, I kind of asked them, I said, when can I have a turn to commit my life to Christ? And I just kind of basically made them have a night where they did an altar call so I could make it official, and became a Christian that way. And I think as an integral part of our journey of faith was that you were involved. So from a very early on in being a Christian, we were talking about missions, we were talking about sponsoring missionaries, we were talking about different ways in which we could get the gospel around the world, even though we were like these 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids in inner city London. So there was always a sense in my mind that there was a calling to something more. But I've got to be honest, on one level I felt called to be a missionary, on another level I really wanted to be a journalist. And I actually genuinely did feel that you could have more impact in the world around you if you had a job, kind of thing. And that I also did feel you could earn more money that way. I think that was probably part of it. And I think the call to ministry was this slow, long, persistent thing that every time I tried to look for a career opportunity, I couldn't get away from the fact that there was something I had to look at. And it probably reached its peak at 19. I had a place at Oxford University to study English. It was an unconditional offer. I'd done the entrance exam. That's what they did back then. And it was a huge thing for our family. An immigrant family with this place at Oxford, and it was when education was still free. And for me, it was my pathway to the media as well. But I'd taken a gap year at a Bible college because I wanted to nail some things about my faith for sure. And I probably knew from day 2 that I wasn't going to go to Oxford. I didn't acknowledge it for about 6 months, but I probably knew from day 2 that there was something else. And I wrestled with it. I really did. I knew I could serve God faithfully there, but I knew that wasn't the path I was meant to go through and go along. And so it was very much a sense of being called to something and not being sure what. And so I gave up the place. I remember saying, okay, God, now what? And I was reminded that once when I was 17, I went to a city called Sheffield and I liked it. And they were the only place in the country at the time that when you did biblical studies, you could learn Greek and Hebrew to the same degree. And so I applied for Sheffield and got in. And I didn't know any more of what I was called to. I just knew that was the next step, and that was the right next step.
And what role did you get involved in St. Thomas's Church in Sheffield?
St. Thomas's, it was a fun one because I kind of went there because there were guys there.
Yeah, of course.
I wasn't really thinking of anything ministry at all. I had another mission. But initially I got involved in the worship team as a volunteer. I was at uni then doing biblical studies, and it had very few hours. So I had a lot of time on my hands. So I got involved in the worship team. I got involved in the youth for a while, and that was on a voluntary basis for a couple of years. But they very much treated you like staff, even though you weren't paid, kind of thing. You were still part of the rhythm and the life of the church and the team. And then I kind of did an internship there. And then my first paid role would have been as on the youth team. And I was working with 11 to 18-year-olds. And then I got involved, I think, I was asked to take on the kind of uni age group. It was a student town, a college student town, uni student town. But there wasn't anything official in the area of kind of uni student ministry, campus ministry. And so I was asked to take that on and set that up. And I think at that point, I was probably 25, 26 by then, was when I really felt, for me, being called to ministry came into its own.
Now, you're the director of 3D Ministries. How did you end up in that role? And what does that role involve? I know these are big questions.
Yeah, they are. It's a fun one. 3DM kind of came out of the story of what was happening at St. Thomas's. And so in some ways it's hard to describe how I got involved, because I feel like I always take people back to a story they don't want to hear, because we were trying to find out ways in which we could connect. I think the stats were 2% of Sheffield went to church on a Sunday, and we were trying to find ways in which we could take the gospel to the people in tangible, accessible ways. What did it mean to be the hands and feet of Jesus? How could we get on what God was already doing in the world around us? And that was over many, many years. It was like a 10-year journey. But out of that, 3DM was born as a number of us moved to the States and were sharing what we'd learned. 3DM was basically the testimony of that time, the tools we'd learned in that time, the trial and error, and our many, many mistakes of that time. And so in some ways, I felt like I was saying, hey, welcome to the family. Welcome to what we did. This is what we learned. Please make different mistakes from us. This is what it meant to be missional in our context. Ask yourself what it means to be missional in yours. And that was the first part of being involved with 3DM. And I think over time, I got involved in various things. I mean, when we moved to the States, I had my girls quite close together. So I was kind of in and out for a long while. And then initially 3DM was functioning as a business, and then it became a non-profit. And at that point, I got asked to chair the board. And now my role in 3DM is mainly reminding us of the DNA. You know, there are many teams around the country and around the globe, actually, who are doing wonderful things. And I think for me, I don't want a nostalgic thing. Do you know what I mean? Let's do it how we did before, because the world has changed massively even since then. But it's to ask ourselves, what did it mean to do discipleship and mission? Are we multiplying what we've done? Are we not just what are we producing, but what are we reproducing in that? It's to ask questions of, do we see the continuum of roles for women that we see in the Bible, that continuum of temple and home that you see in the New Testament? How are we investing in that? And how are we spending ourselves on the next generation? Because the story of Sheffield really was for us of getting out the way for the next generation to do their thing, but not just abandoning them to it either, investing, empowering, equipping, releasing, and making sure those things are part of our story, making sure us working out how to walk in the power of the Spirit was part of our story as well. And chairing the board in many ways is an accountability about those things and asking how are we doing on those things and what are we seeing God do and how do we get in on what God is doing with those things today.
So I know that a lot of it is based in the story of the ministry, but I guess there's always a temptation for people to want just the package or the program. Yeah. So how do you seek to resist some of that impulse or that drive that's coming all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is I've had to learn to be compassionate to that, because I think you meet pastors and leaders who just want to do well, you know, and they went into ministry, they sacrificed time and energy, and they want it to work. They want it to work, and they want something to grow, and they're working long hours that people don't recognize, not really the best paid, and they've made sacrifices. And so often the way I come around it is by not saying, oh, no, you don't want to do this, but I ask people what they went into ministry for in the first place. And when the call began, what inspired them? What did they see? What price did they pay? and I kind of remind them of that. And we found that it's been really important to stay story driven in what we do. Yeah, to share the tools and the symbols and all the kind of, we use a lot of matrices, and to use those, but that to start with the story of what we see in the Gospels and the New Testament of Jesus and his family on a mission, and then to say the story of what we encountered as we try to imitate that and the tools that helped us along the way. And that's been a good way to engage with people on that.
And how do you connect mission with discipleship? Because I think there is something unique that 3DM is doing around the idea of missional church and discipleship-centred spirituality and so on.
Yeah.
So how do you connect those things?
I mean, at the risk of sounding really twee, and I think it's what we see Jesus doing. I think we connect it because I think we realise that when Jesus made disciples, mission was an integral part of it. I think when discipleship hasn't got mission involved, we're not actually discipling people. And so I love in some ways the phrase missional discipleship, even though it's kind of repeating something, because it reminds us of probably what we've left behind and what we've forgotten to do. And I think it was taking a long, hard look at thinking, okay, how we do discipleship doesn't always produce people who are mature in character and their gifts. They may have a lot of information, not knowledge in their heads. When Jesus did discipleship, it produced people who did what he did, who engaged how he engaged in the world around them, and the subsequent fruit of that. So what are we missing? Well, we've probably not discipled people in mission as well. So I think that was our journey on it.
How does 3DM help churches equip missional discipleship-centred leaders?
There are a range of ways. Often we have, there's content, coaching, communities, and something else beginning with C, which I've probably forgotten. Oh, consulting or something like that. And part of the coaching is a journey of helping people look at what do we see in the DNA of the Bible in terms of our covenant relationship with God and our kingdom call, and reminding people of, it's not new. We've just often got too busy. We've often forgotten. We've often overemphasized something. We've all done it, hope for the silver bullet that would change the world. And so so part of our coaching is getting people to think through again and to observe really closely what Jesus did, and to ask ourselves pertinent questions of what it would look like for us to do that. Our coaching revolves around that. One of my favourite things that we get to do is we gather churches into teams across denominations, into learning communities, and we take them on a two-arc journey. Two-year arc of a journey, looking at how you build a discipling culture, how you multiply missional leaders, how you launch missional communities, and how you lead kingdom movements. Not saying that happens over 2 years, because it rarely does. But you can't be taking people on it forever. They've got to get the skin in the game and enjoy the journey. But what that does is we get them as teams thinking through, what's God calling you to? Because most people we connect with are hungry and asking questions about discipleship, about the missional conversation, about engaging with the challenges of their day. So in some ways, we're not trying to convince anybody. We're responding to a question they're already asking. They're asking, how do we do discipleship differently? What does it mean for us to make disciples? And so we have this journey of a learning community to share some tools and things. One of our primary vehicles for discipleship that we discovered through trial and error was what we call huddles. We weren't very good at names, but it was basically groups of men and women who you'd ask how you're doing in your relationship with God. And again, it's not new. Wesley did it with the class meeting. We just kind of thought it was good to carry on, that kind of thing. So it's things like that we do, coming alongside churches and individuals and teams, processing together what it looks like to engage.
Now, I think you say that Jesus' life is a model of missional discipleship.
Yeah.
But there's a concern that this has been lost in the life of the church. So how do we begin to look at the life of Jesus and rediscover missional discipleship in the life of the church?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that Jesus wasn't just the best at saving us, but that he was the best leader. And that we often listen to his words, but we don't look at the way he did things. And I think we often encourage our leaders that we work with to look at how he did it, to look at the way he made disciples, not just that he did. I think often we're like, okay, Jesus made disciples, so must I. end of story, rather than Jesus made disciples. He's the best leader we've got. He's the best example we'll ever have. How did he make disciples? What distinctives do we have? When we look at his life, we see that he gave access to these people. We see that prayer was a fundamental part of how he gathered his disciples. We see that it was incarnational. We see that that he got them practicing things. Are we doing those things? That's been a key part of it for us in helping people understand again. In some ways, it almost sounds a bit cliched to say we look at Jesus, but actually we as an apprentice, as a disciple, we remind ourselves the word Mathetes is someone who studies his life. And so we try and study the 360 of his life and say, rather than just copying or agreeing intellectually with the sense that and the things that he says, to actually allow him to be our coach in how we lead and how we build communities.
Sometimes I suppose we start to think that information is enough for understanding better doctrine, getting our heads across the catechisms, memorising the words of Jesus, but information is not really enough, is it, when it comes to discipleship?
No, because it wasn't enough. It wasn't the way Jesus did it. I think it sets us up to fail because we give people lots of input and we wonder why their lives aren't changed, and we give people lots of information, downloads, and we make it more robust, and maybe we show them the aorist tense or something in the Greek, and we hope that will help them get past their past. We hope that will help them spend money better. We hope that will help them deal with their vices and their virtues, their addictions and the things they're ashamed of. And we wonder why it doesn't build character. But Jesus didn't just give an intellectual download with the disciples. He modeled it, he illustrated it for them. He interacted, and we know the rabbinic method was far more question and answer than we get to see in the Bible anyway. He gave them opportunities to practice the things that they were learning from him. And I mean, when we think about it, practically speaking, in other areas of life, we'd never sit with it. Like you went for surgery or something. You want someone who's done it. You don't want someone who's just got a passion for it, who's read a few good books. They're not touching your body. You want someone who's actually kind of got their hand in somebody else, made their mistakes on somebody else if possible, so that they're skilled. And all around us, we believe in apprenticeship. And we've recognised that an apprenticeship isn't just an academic exercise. It includes the knowledge, for sure. But actually, there's some point when you've got to have some skin in the game. You've got to be learning. You've got to practice how to drive the car. You've got to practice the recipe. You can't just read it. And how much more so in the area of discipleship. When we look at Jesus and when we look at the early church, we see there's this invitation to stand at somebody's shoulder and learn from their life, and to have a living illustration of the gospel. And I think as I think of how I grew over the years, not growing in a Christian context, I learned so much about the Bible. I was taught really well as a kid growing up about tithing and about just all kinds of stuff and about relationships. But I didn't know what things looked like. And I wasn't looking for a hero to save me. I'd already had that. What I needed was a human being who would say, this is what it looks like to work out how you value money in a culture where you're dealing with debt. This is what it looks like to forgive when you hate somebody. This is what it means to pick up your cross, deny yourself and follow Jesus when all your desires are saying, go, 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 no one's watching, kind of thing. You need to have conversations with people about that. You need to have accessible role models, people who are legit human beings, you know what I mean? They're not kind of automatrons pretending, but who are actually working it out too.
Most of the literature on missional theology and even classical missiology almost never touches on the role of family in mission and discipleship. But how does 3DM prioritise the role of family, and how do you understand family in missional communities?
I think, again, when we're looking at the life of Jesus, we see that he built a family around him, that they were a community, a family on a mission. And I love that. I love where Jesus, it's a single guy, that we see the 12, but we know, like Luke 8, there's Joanna, Susanna, and Mary. We know that there's a 72 who didn't just meet him for the first time, kind of thing, that there's this community. And again, you see it with the early church. You see that the oikos, the households of faith, which are the context of growth, of multiplication, of maturity, of mission. And I think, for me, of growing up in a as a Brit, but a Nigerian Brit, the extended family wasn't a big deal to me. It's our way. It's our way of being. Everybody's your aunt. It took me many years to work out who was actually a blood relative, and then I just didn't bother because it's not anything that we care about. The extended family is alive and well in many parts of the world. It seems to be the Western world where it's kind of worn thin somewhat over the years. So when we were looking at how Jesus did it, and how the early church did it, we see this extended family unit, which is a social and economic unit, which seemed to bankroll the mission, support the mission. You're stronger together. There's this African proverb, a well-worn one, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think there is something in going further when you go together that's central to this. We have burnt out on being rugged individuals. We've burnt out on having superstars trying to do stuff. And I'm not saying that to decry anybody's gifts. I just think you go further when there's more of you, when you multiply that into your family in some way. And again, I look at the early church and think, what do they have to get past to live the way they did? The church in Antioch and the leadership team, which is multi-ethnic and different socioeconomic stratas, as it were. What did they have to get past, and what did that say to the world around them when they didn't have rock star buildings and rock star budgets and rock star preachers and worship leaders? What did that? It was their relationships that said something. It's how their families looked that said something. And what did it look like, even for the church in Jerusalem, to see how they functioned together, how people would treat people who technically was your slave or technically was a woman, practically was a woman. How did you, what did that spoke volumes. And I think actually that would still speak volumes today. And so some of the things that we encourage within the context of 3DM is to say to leaders, who are your household? Who's your oikos? How are you doing life together? How are you exploring life together? How is this a context where people can learn from you, where people can be sent from your oikos? And what does it mean for us to reclaim the extended family? I couldn't lead without an extended family. I just couldn't do it without that community.
I guess there's always a danger for us as well to domesticate the gospel, to shape it in the image of our own cultural perspectives and norms and so on. But what does it mean to embrace a dangerous, risky, adventure-filled gospel?
I think it means to ask yourself what's yet to be done. Do you know what I mean? In terms of what are the frontiers out there. I mean, I'm not a fan of danger for danger's sake. I mean, I think dangerous, but we don't have to be reckless now. I mean, I have been. I was talking with a friend the other day, and we were talking about places we used to prayer walk in the middle of the night, and she said, we were crazy, we could have been killed. and I think there's a fun aspect of that. But I sometimes think we're really boring as Christians, and we're really safe, and we've made it about behaviour modification rather than the renewal of all things. And I think the reason why we get bored as Christians is because we're dull. We're dull. We haven't thought of what could we do to see the world changed and make it a better place. What audacious, ridiculously bizarre goal are we rusting up to see if God could do something about that? God, what could you do about human trafficking? What could you do about racial reconciliation? What could you do about our local school? What could you do in my neighbourhood? And I think that's what it means to say this good news, way too good to keep to yourself. Who could we share it with? And how? And what would it mean if we, everyday ordinary people, stopped second-guessing and thinking we need a qualification to even step out the door and actually tried something? I think it would mean us trying some things in the name of Jesus.
And how do we embrace celebration, uniting purpose and play?
I think we take Jesus seriously and not ourselves quite so much. Do you know what I mean? I think we got to take ourselves a lot less seriously. I think the thing when I think about this that comes to mind is when my kids were learning how to walk. I remember when Tia in particular my firstborn learned how to walk, and we celebrated the 2 steps that she had this kind of waddle a couple of steps and fell down. And we didn't look at it and think, oh man, you've got to get 5, 6, 7. You'll never do a marathon that way. We celebrated the 2 steps. It's like you did 2 steps. Who cares if they waddled and you looked kind of scary? You did 2 steps, and that's the amazing thing. And I think with us as church, we could do with celebrating our 2 steps more. We could do with a few more meals, a lot more parties, of the 2 steps of the adventure. Like our feedback and review meetings could really do with some fun in them when we say, hey, tomorrow we'll talk about what we could do next time on our mission. But today we're going to celebrate the 2 steps we took, and the fact that we dared, and the fact that we landed gloriously on our faces because we got in the arena and we actually did something. And I think it's good for the soul. It's good for the community. It's good for the families. The family celebration of what the head of the family is leading us in and what he's done for us. I think it's just really important, and it's that thing about encouragement that gives you the courage to carry on.
In your book, More Than Enchanting, you talk about the central role that women have played in the history of the church.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit of a snapshot of the centrality of the role that women have played in the history of the church?
I mean, I think it's almost, where do you want to start?
Yeah.
I mean, do you start at the resurrection, where a woman whose testimony wasn't valid in a court of law is the one given the task of telling the disciples that Jesus is risen? Or do you start at the early church, whether it's Eunice and Lois, the mother and grandmother of Timothy, who disciple one of the most incredible leaders of the New Testament? Or whether we start with Lydia, who is this businesswoman who welcomes the church into her home and is the gateway to Europe. And you see this whole, and then there's Priscilla and Phoebe and Nympha and Chloe, these oikos, these household leaders doing all these insane things, or Joanna, Susanna and Mary. And if we went even into the Old Testament, you see the prophetesses and these women who have these significant roles. And then you look at all these women throughout church history, many of whom have escaped my mind at this time, but whether it's a Susanna Wesley or a Catherine Booth, or whether it's some of the Celtic abbesses, and you see that when we acknowledge and recognise and invest in the sheer range of gifting, the sheer range of potential, the church is propelled forward by that. And it's a really exciting, invigorating thing. And I think it's a story that we need to tell, because we need to see ourselves in the big story. We need to see women in the story, because otherwise you have women doubting that they have a contribution to make in the story. I can't remember who said it, but there's this phrase, you can't be what you can't see. And when you don't see it, you're filled with self-doubt.
Even though women have been right at the heart or the centre of the story and history of the church, they've often been marginalised in church and society. I mean, what do you think are some of the ways in which the church in particular has marginalised its women?
I think when we have not considered how best to equip and empower them, when we've had a single track of leadership training, which doesn't necessarily feel male, but in the times of day it happens, in the culture that is created around those things, in the lack of acknowledgement of what family life means, and it actually means it for male and female. It's just that often our processes, our leadership processes, are contingent on someone else looking after your kids, and it's assumed that it's a woman who's doing that. Well, if a woman's coming through into leadership and the guy has a job or isn't that, then what do we do? When we're not actually proactive about making an environment for our women and for anybody to come through, to be honest. I mean, I don't think it's just women who are affected by this. I think predominantly they are. I think that gets in the way. I think when we don't tell the stories of the women of the Bible, the amount of people who I found who said, I didn't know Huldah was there. I didn't know Priscilla was there. I didn't know Lydia was there. I didn't know much about Deborah. I didn't, and I thought, we're not telling their stories. We're not. These are women in the Word. Miriam is relevant, and when they're not from the pulpit, when they're not from the places which are seen as the places of authority, it's not that they're never taught about, but they may be kind of sidelined into a Bible study. And I'm not trying to make a Bible study seem a lesser thing. It's just that we all know what we celebrate are the things we communicate on a Sunday. That's just our reality, for the most part. If those stories aren't told on that day, and they're not seen to be relevant to women and men, they're seen as less relevant. They just are. I think those are just even a couple of ways. I think when we're not looking I mean, I think the job of every missiologist is to look at the world around us and look at the artifacts of our culture and ask what word Jesus speaks to that culture and how we engage. And I think we have to do that in relation to gender. I think we have to ask those questions.
We see some traditions that marginalise women or treat women a particular way because of their reading of Scripture.
Yeah.
And they're quite upfront about that. But others that actually take a egalitarian position, at least on paper, but then when you look at their practices, you begin to wonder whether there's any correlation between the things that they say, the things that they publish, and their behaviours. I think sometimes that is worse in many ways.
I agree with you. I find it more frustrating because I think that I don't have to agree with those who have a different theological perspective. You respect it. It's a different deal. You know what I mean? That's and the women who choose to be part of that community, we have to trust that theologically that's the conclusion they've come to, and we respect and honour that too. But if you're saying that you believe in investing in women leaders, don't talk a good game. You do what you believe in, and we'll see it not by what you say or by what you write, but by what's happening in your community. We'll see it by the people that you are empowering, and you will actually acknowledge some of the obstacles. You'll go the extra mile if you believe it's something worth fighting for, and the best things are worth fighting for. I too find it worse because what you find is you find women and men who believe in women in leadership frustrated because they're like, we talk a good game here, but we're still not getting anybody forward. I'm still not seeing it in the places that we say are the most important places. We have no leadership pipelines. We have no affirmation. We've traded on safe. We say that we don't know where the women are, which is a line I've heard more times than I would ever care to remember. We don't know where they are, which means I'm not looking. I'm not looking, and I'm not going to be persistent. I'm expecting them to come to me and offer themselves. And yet if that happened, I'd probably feel a little bit weirded out by that prospect as well. And so I think we probably, if we believe that women are to be to express their gifts in every part of the church, then we have to ask ourselves, is my way of discipling women effective? Is my leadership development effective? Is it producing fruit? It may be saying to everybody we believe that women can lead. Who are my women leaders? And honestly, if I'm in a position of privilege, what will I do to dismantle that privilege to get out of the way? And I think the hard part of it is if you're in a privileged position, and we all have different areas of privilege in our lives, don't we? But if you're in a privileged position, to change it feels like you're almost being oppressed in some way because it means less for you. It does. It means sacrifice for you. And I think the leaders that I've noticed for me over the years who've opened doors sacrificed something for me to be there. They had to. That was the only way it was going to happen. They sacrificed their platforms. I mean, quite literally. When I was at St. Thomas's and Mike Breen was the senior pastor, there was a conference we were at, and he basically knew that was the way that the door would be opened. And our church was given that night to take care of, and he said, okay, Joe, you're going to do it. And I don't think I realised until years later when I was speaking and you know what the circuit does and the opportunities those platforms give you, the sacrifice he made, you know? I knew Mike and I trusted Mike and I knew he was willing to give something up, but I wasn't aware of all the implications of what he'd given up. And I remember someone saying to him, oh, we thought we'd hear you this week, Mike. We thought that you'd be speaking. He said, no, you heard her. That's as much. You heard me. That's someone I've discipled who's now getting into what they're about, and that's what we're aiming for. And I would encourage leaders, if they're serious about that, how can they build the kind of pipeline that makes it an accessible win? They don't have to lower the standards as such as though women are lesser beings. They just have to recognise that the opportunities aren't always the same.
Do you think there are some ways in which women might sideline themselves with some of their... And how is that expressed?
I do think so. I think there are lots of ways. I remember talking to some women at an event once and asking them, I had this gut feeling where I should ask them, are there things that you feel called to that you've not mentioned yet? And 80% of the room raised their hand. I'm like, did I get the question wrong? And so I asked it again, and I kept on repeating it until someone interrupted me and said, no, we heard you the first time, shut up. And I said, why aren't you doing it? And they said, well, who am I? Who do I think I am? Isn't it arrogant to say that I feel called to this? Won't I seem like I'm like really aggressively domineering? Won't I be seen as someone who's trying to grab a role and usurp guys? And the overthinking and the I think Edmund Friedman used to call it like the whole imaginative gridlock. You're asking yourself the same questions, but they're the wrong questions. You've seen it in black and white, and it's like, oh, well, how do I do this? And I can't do this, and I can't possibly. Often exhausts women leaders before they even get in the game. I think the pain of it all, it can be quite draining and it can be quite lonely. And I think you do that on your own, you have no energy. And they often have to be encouraged to build a network of relationships that give you the energy to carry on in some way. I think sometimes you do wrestle with the reality that you feel you have to be twice as good for half the recognition. And I think sometimes you do. I don't want to pretend we're not at a deficit. We are at a deficit. We're on deficit in terms of gender. We're certainly on a deficit when it comes to race. And I think there is a pioneering task, even when you don't feel naturally bent as a pioneer, that women have to engage with, for the sake of the bigger picture, for the sake of the journey. And it's hard, and it's blood, sweat, and tears. I think we have to allow the pressure not to put us off, but to be creative as well. I think those are some ways we kind of self-identify us out. We don't say the idea that's in our mind, and then we get frustrated when the guy in the room says it, things like that.
What do you think are ways that women can discover or rediscover their gifts and their talents and their contribution to the life of the church?
Yeah. I often encourage women to look at a number of things. I tell them to look at the characters in the Bible. I say, have a look at Deborah, have a look at Esther, and I kind of go through a list and say, come back and tell me who inspired you and why. Because I do feel it's important to see yourself in the context of the Bible. I get them to think through being made in the image of God, and to say, what if your gifts weren't a concession? And what if your personality, I think, what if your mentality, particularly those who are strategic thinkers and kind of big goals, what if that wasn't a concession, but was actually part of the heart of God for you? I get them to look at the whole thing of the Azer in Genesis 2:18 and the helper, and it being a combination of these words, meaning to rescue and to save and to be powerful and strong, and saying, what if your strength, if strength was feminine? What if this is how you're wired, and it's just you being your father's daughter? And often I just leave them with those questions for a while, because that messes up your head for a good while. And so those are some of the things. Then I often get them to look in the culture around them, because often you see the more accessible pictures there. I think what I often encourage people first to do is just to take a long, hard look. Take a long, hard look at the Bible, the women in the Bible. Take a long, hard look at what it means to be made in the image of God. Take a long, hard look at what you see people doing well in the world around you, women in history, because when there aren't as many accessible role models around, you have to kind of do the research. Look at the missionaries of history. Look at the few that you say are there, and what inspires you. I encourage them to do that, whether it's your Myers-Briggs thing or some gift mix, because I think we have so often apologized for our gift and we think it's not there, and it's hard to find. I get them to say, ask your friends what you're good at, what you're skilled at. Or I get them to experiment and say, take a week where you just assume you're a leader, where you're not going to apologize for it, and just see what it feels like. See what you're not going to say kind of. You're not going to be embarrassed by it. You're going to be unapologetic. I often ask women to ask themselves a question, ask themselves a couple of questions. If you could do something and you weren't afraid, what would you do? If you were unapologetic about your gifts, what are they? Because I think that is honestly the biggest battle. Because often they work hard, they're really skilled, and often they've taken a path of working hard in the hope of getting some recognition, and then just feel really frustrated when someone pats them on the back and says, "Great, I'm really glad you do this for me," instead of realizing that sometimes you have to articulate what you're about. And so those are some of the ways I really encourage women. I encourage them to find other women. In the world where we've got social media and stuff, I say, you might not find a mentor just like you just yet, but ask people loads of questions. Loads of questions. Travel the length of the country if you need to. Your gift is worth investing in. What God's called you to is worth investing in. The impact you'll have is worth investing in, and know that these are valid uses of your time and your resources and your energy to do that. I get them to read, but often I find them encountering people is a really important thing. Men and women who affirm their gift, who affirm what they bring to the table, and then I'd say find a place where you can practice it.
When you travel around speaking in places about a variety of different issues, what's usually misunderstood about what you're saying?
You probably have to ask someone else that question. What's usually misunderstood about what?
Or if you hear somebody feeding back to you the things that you're saying, you think, that's not what I'm saying. Where do you feel that there might be some misunderstanding about some key things that you're saying?
I think probably on the missional conversation, actually. That would be one of the areas. I think sometimes, although you say with the best will in the world, this is not a panacea. There is not a silver bullet. They're like, so when you did this and this and this, it worked, right? I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. That is probably the conversation that comes up most of all. Or are you saying these things are bad? And I'm like, no, not at all. And I kind of try and work hard to articulate in a way that speaks somebody else's language so they can understand. I think that kind of communication thing. But that's probably the worst or the best one is people are still looking for a way to make it a quick fix. They're still seeing missional stuff as... the other one is, when we're talking about being missional, it's about connecting with people who are still like me. I'm like, no, you can't do this without sacrifice. You're going to have to cross the road. You're going to have to find somebody. It's not sexy. It's not that exciting. It's just the call. Those are the ones still where I mean, and I don't know how you communicate when you've got 30 minutes. You're telling stories that were 10 years long. Or stories over the years, and they hear it in a condensed version, and it sounds like that's your life. And it's like, no, the rest of the time you're sowing seeds and hoping someone cares. Do you know what I mean? Hoping someone's listening. But you haven't got time to give them that boring information too. So I think it's in those areas that the missional conversation isn't actually about conversation. I'm not interested in what you're saying. I'm interested in how we're living. That's probably the biggest part.
What do you think are a couple of the greatest challenges facing the church today?
I actually think gender is one of them. I think it strategically, and again, like I said, I want to honour those who have a different theological perspective, but I would say this to them too: equip your women, even in the framework that equip your women in the framework that you believe, equip them to get it done. But I actually think. For those of us who say that we do believe in empowering leaders and stuff, the fact that we're not doing that is costing us. And I don't just mean women are upset. Yes, they are. It's costing us in terms of the kingdom. It's costing us in terms of initiatives and opportunities and resourcing, things that creativity. What ideas are lying in the ground of someone's low self-esteem? Do you know what I mean? What opportunities lying in the ground of somebody not having a chance to hone an idea? What sermons aren't we hearing that could change our lives? All that kind of stuff. What projects aren't happening because of that? I think it's costing. I think the kingdom suffers because we're lazy on gender. I mean, I would say I think we're lazy on gender. I think we're lazy on race as well. And I think that costs us too. I think I remember being at a church a few weeks ago where there were 50 nations represented in the congregation and in the staff, and it flavoured the worship. And I thought, yeah, heaven is meant to look like this. And so often church doesn't look like this. And what is it costing us again when we're not engaging with the hard, painful work in whatever nation we're in, honestly, when it comes to race? When we're not acknowledging whose stories haven't we validated, and in invalidating their story, we've missed out some understanding of the Bible. We've missed out some understanding of theology that they would have brought to us. You know, that there's a contribution that every tribe and tongue has to make. And when we default, and sometimes it is a lazy default, to a particular bent that's comfortable and easy, we miss out. And it affects our community life, and it affects our mission life, and it affects our devotional life. I think us engaging with those things is going to be huge. I think if there was another, I suppose there would be another one that I would wonder is how do we, as church, equip people for the life we already have, in terms of the workplace, in terms of what does it mean to be a missionary at the workplace, and what does it mean for us as church leaders if we've not been in the workplace for a long time, to equip people for that, and is there something we need to do about that?
Jo Saxton, thank you for joining us at the Global Church Project.
Thank you very much.
The Global Church Project is located at www.theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website, you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities, and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.